I am Sean.
Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live in Ottawa, Ontario. A happy 2018 to everybody. Our first episode back in the new year. We took a bit of a break there since December, but we're back and we're going to have a series of shows for you, talking to a bunch of different people about books, mostly. The first few episodes that we have are looking at some new books, and very excited today to be joined by the author of Blood, Sweat, and Fear, Violence at Work in the North American Auto Industry, 1960 to 1980, coming at us live from Kingston, Ontario. Jeremy Milloy, welcome to the show.
Hi, Sean. Thanks very much for having me.
I've been looking forward to this for the past couple of weeks since your editors got in touch with me about the possibility of this, because it seems like such a timely topic to talk about, this idea of violence in the workplace in the context of everything that's been going on. And I'm just curious for you, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the book, how has the reaction been from people in the context of what's happened in the past year or so to what you're doing? Because not often, or at least for me, not often does the research you do as a historian all of a sudden become super relevant like this. So what has that been like for you?
To be honest, I haven't heard too much about that connection, although I'm certainly very aware of it. In the context of what I do, it's coming up a bit more and more now, obviously. When it first came out in September, October, didn't hear as much from readers about it. But the last time I did an interview about it, I was on the radio in Kansas City a couple weeks ago, and Judy Ansell, who interviewed me there for the Heartland Labor Forum, she definitely asked about it, about the connections between, obviously, how widespread harassment and sexual abuse and sexual violence in the workplace has become known as. So it's starting to become more part of the conversation, definitely, about the book. So that is definitely a connection, and it's something that in terms of specifically gendered violence is definitely a feature of the research I talk about in my book. Sexual violence too, to an extent, and just in this wider context of violence under capitalism. People asked me when I was writing the book, like, what do you define as workplace violence, right? And I think what the conversation is showing is that, and it's something that reflects what I argue in the book, that it's a much broader and more widely shared experience, or I should say set of experiences, than I think people used to think about until maybe very recently. So I think there might be an awareness of the workplace now as a site of violence and multiple violences in a way that even, as you say, 6 months to a year ago wasn't as widely acknowledged or understood.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really interesting. When I was going through the introduction, you make the point there that when people think about violence in the workplace or worker violence in the relationship between employees and employers, they, in Canadian context, point to things like the Winnipeg General Strike. In the United States, things like Haymarket and those sorts of big riot events or strikes that turn into violence. But what you talk about is that there's a lot more, like daily things that happen that's violence. You start the book out, I think, in a very, I don't know, provocative is the right word, but a really interesting way, talking about legislation in the United States that allows people to bring firearms to work and the debate that surrounded that, and how that could lead to violence, right? Having weapons in the workplace, how that's dangerous. So how then do you define violence in a way that sort of makes sense? Because when most people see this title, right, the word violence, they think of physical violence, something that's tangible, somebody getting punched in the face or stabbed or whatever it is. But I get the sense that you're talking about something a lot broader.
Yeah, myself personally, I try not to impose like a unitary definition of violence, because one of the things that I want to talk about is our definition of violence changes over time. And our understandings of what violence is change over time. And also, as a historian, what I was interested in was looking back and seeing, well, what did people consider violence? Because there's a lot of violence happening in these workplaces in the 1960s and 70s, but nobody really refers to it as quote-unquote workplace violence, if that makes sense. It's not like a specifically bracketed social problem with like a set of experts and things that they're going to do about, but there's quite clearly a lot of violence. And so what I noticed looking back is there's a debate over what constitutes violence in the workplace, is what I'm trying to say. So I always wanted to be really alive to that. I want to be really alive to say, well, what were different people defining as violence? What were companies defining as violence? What were unions? What were individual workers? And that changes over time. You know, the two examples that really come to me that make me think it was valuable that I did that was, number one, Pat Cunningham, who's one of the pioneering female workers at Windsor Chrysler. You know, there was no female workers there basically until the mid-70s, when the government basically forced Chrysler to start hiring female workers as a condition of getting some funding. And she experienced a lot of harassment and intimidation as one of the first female workers on that shop floor. You know, I asked her, I was like, well, what happened to you? Did you consider that violence? Do you consider that violence? You know, what you experienced in the workplace? And, you know, like, yeah, there was no physical, like, she never reported to me anybody physically, hitting her or anything, but it was a lot of, comments and things being put in her face and being followed after work and stuff like that. And she said, at the time I didn't, but knowing what I know now and having the experience I've had and the perspective, then yeah, I do. And so that gives you an understanding of how people's understandings of violence change over time. Mm-hmm. And also, there was a quote by a set of workers in the 70s that said basically, why is it that when a boss gets hit in the face by a worker with a pipe, that's considered violence and it makes the evening news, but we don't consider it violence when, workers have heart attacks from working on the line, or workers are crushed to death because the line's running too fast. Right. Why is that considered violence and that's not? So I as you point out, it's a really expansive definition of violence that I employ, and I'm also really alive to the way that violence itself, what constitutes violence, is a site of struggle. People are, struggling to argue what is, to name and to define what is happening to them or what has happened to them. And I think that's also similar to the dynamics that we're seeing in the months since the book was released.
And especially in the context right now. I mean, as we're recording this last week, I can't remember what day of the week it was, but was the Bell Let's Talk thing. And for as much of a problem as I have with Bell sort of making a commercial out of the whole thing, the idea that they're raising awareness, and they're doing a good job in that aspect of it, but if you talk about violence, mental health issues, and maybe a lack of respect for mental health in the workplace, that could be seen as a place of violence, even if it doesn't necessarily lead to physical violence. The internal problems that people can have, or the, I don't know if that sounds right, but at least with mental health, if people don't feel safe or they're unable to have an opportunity to express themselves or open up about what's going on, that could be seen as violent.
Yeah, absolutely. And the question is, with things like initiatives like Well Let's Talk that I always want to talk about is what is the actual relationship between workplace dynamics and workplace environments and this thing happening. And that's one of the things that that mental illness is not something that workers have. It's something that is produced in the workplace, right? Mm-hmm. It's not something, it's a very individualized model, I think, of mental health sometimes, where it's just seen as mental health is just, yes, we should talk about it, we should be open about our struggles about it, but it's always seen still as something that happens individually. And I still think we're mostly not taking that necessary step back and being like, is there something about the way that our society is set up, socially, economically, politically, that's causing mental health to be such a massive problem on such a wide scale? Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If it is a disease like any other, if 40% of people in one community were getting cancer, we'd start testing the water, right? I don't know why we were not testing the water with respect to mental health, or the air. And so the thing with workplace violence is I wanted to have that conversation. I wanted my book to open a way into that conversation to say what extent is the violence that happens at work because of the structural ways in which work was set up. Right. And it wasn't that, I tell people with respect to, how much violence there was at these Detroit Chrysler plants in the late 60s and 70s. The explanation isn't, well, Chrysler must have hired a bunch of terrible people and leave it at that. You know what I mean? Just they must have hired 500 to 1,000 terrible people over 3 years. You have to, as historians, start to ask bigger questions about why this is happening at a certain time and place and what are the factors that make it possible.
Yeah, right. It's like there was the experiment they took. I think it was college kids, and they put them in a jail, and they said, you are the guards, you're the prisoners, and they told the guards you can do whatever you want, and these are just regular people, and they started to brutalize. Right? Like that sort of experiment shows that the situation has a lot to do with how people react, how people respond.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And when you were talking there, the other thing I think of in terms of violence and, what is violence, what isn't, I think asbestos is a really interesting one, right? In the asbestos mines, those workers, you're right. A lot of people wouldn't consider that violence, but a lot of those people, got lung cancer, died early. That's a violent act.
Yeah, there's a point in which during the early 70s in the book I mentioned that the UAW, I got this from the George Jacobson Serkin book, Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, that they quote a UAW study that the toll every year of injuries and deaths in the auto industry from things like exposures and heart attacks and accidents, quote unquote, and stuff, were greater every year of the Vietnam War than the U.S. casualty and death toll was in that war. And so they're clearly quite trying to make that comprehension to where is violence really taking place in American life in the 60s and 70s, whereas, the popular discourse is it's happening in Quezon, and they're saying, well, no, it's actually happening in Detroit and, California, where these auto plants are.
Wow.
The asbestos thing too is particularly relevant for me being from Peterborough, just with I don't know if you've seen any of the series in the Toronto Star over the past year about exposures by General Electric workers and the numerous workers that have cancer that they believe happened as a result of their occupations and their struggle to get workplace compensation for that. And again, it's how do we define that in the system? How do we take responsibility for that? How do we apportion this? Because the workers themselves, being complex people, have very complex reactions to their experiences at GE. There are people who are quite upset about what's happened, but there's also people who talk about how it was a good workplace that provided a good standard of living for working class and middle class people in Peterborough. So these are really complicated legacies.
Right. Yeah. It's not as simple as if someone punches you in the face. That's clear. Right?
Yeah.
But yeah. It's a lot more complicated. So if we get into the book. Specifically, why then the auto industry? It's clear that these are complicated issues that exist in all industries. And I will say that I have a personal connection to the auto industry. My grandfather worked for Ford for a long time. My uncle had also worked for Ford in the plants. So I have a personal connection to this, which when I saw the title, it further intrigued me because of that. But why specifically look at the auto industry when these issues are, as you mentioned, universal?
Well, I started this as my PhD dissertation. So obviously, you might be able to relate to this. I had these grandiose plans of what I was going to do, right?
You're going to write the greatest thing ever, yeah.
Yeah, it was going to be amazing. Everything was going to be in there. And I was going to do, because I'm aware that the auto industry is in the mid to late 20th century, you can make an argument it's the most important industry, or, certainly one of them, in terms of labor relations, its place in the economy, it's a massively important industry, but there's a lot of things that it doesn't represent. It's not exclusively male, as the book points out, but it's heavily gendered male. It's manufacturing employment, it's working class employment. So there's a lot of things that get left out. So I wanted to do, and also geographically, I wanted to do Seattle and Vancouver. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to do Toronto and Detroit, not Windsor and Detroit. And I wanted to, did I have an East Coast? I think I just chose those 4 cities because I was being conservative. And I wanted to do postal work, manufacturing employment, and some type of office or retail employment.
Okay.
Because I was really interested in, for example, in the postal service, both Canada's and America's postal service undergo an intense restructuring and intensification of work in the 70s and 80s. Yet in America, there's several individual postal massacres, which gave rise to the term going postal. Yet in Canada, where there's an equal amount of class conflict at the post office in the 70s, and people like Jean-Claude Perrault going to jail for defying Pierre Trudeau and stuff, you don't get that here. And so I was really interested to say, well, why did that happen in America, not happen here, right?
Right.
So I started researching it, and basically there was just so much there when I started looking at the auto industry in both Windsor and Detroit, and such a good basis for a cross-national comparison, because Chrysler, the focus of my work, my study is, active in Windsor and Detroit, and it's the same union on both sides of the border, which really allowed some interesting kind of cross-border comparisons. I just thought there was so much there that there was no way I was going to do a good job if I spread myself too thin, and I should just really focus on everything that was in auto. So it ended up being on auto. But, quite frankly, there are, I wouldn't say limitations, but the study is the way it is because of auto, and violence would look different in different workplaces. Jacob Reams, who was one of my critics for this book at Social Science History Association, pointed out, just ask the question, what would this look like if it was a predominantly female workplace, right? Retail or office or healthcare, and I said the nature of the violence, who was using it, and how it was used would be different. So that, that's one important thing to keep in mind. That I don't think this is certainly the last word on it, but it's an understanding of how workplace violence worked in one industry at this time.
But at the same time, as you mentioned, I mean, there's the limitations to that. But the auto industry, I think it, and sorry for cutting you off, but does it not sort of represent something uniquely North American too? I mean, there's postal services around the world, there's retail offices around the world, and certainly there's other places that make cars, but it strikes me that the auto industry in North America, particularly in Detroit, like there's something that is unique to it, that this book itself, if you look at, and I'd be curious if someone has ever done this, but if you look at the way cars are manufactured in Japan, for instance, if you would find the same stuff that you're finding here, because North America and cars, just the car culture that we have, just the way our cities and towns are built, as well as the manufacturing of it, and the way in which it's just such a major industry, it strikes me as that it makes it very much a North American study.
This is a very North American study, and I'm not sure about Japan. I know there is quite a lot of violence happening in the Indian auto industry today.
Okay.
And very much of that earlier kind of group violence, of like a group of people confronting or kidnapping a manager,
right.
And that kind of cross-class violence that we see. I'm not sure about Japanese plants, but I will say, I mean, it's kind of like, I think maybe I did go a little heavy there on the limitations of the auto workplace, but it's a very iconic workplace culturally for the North American working class. And another thing that I think is really, really important about it is that it is like the heartland of Fordism, right? It's the heartland of the post-war compromise of that these, of the good working class jobs, quote unquote, that undergirded the 30 years of prosperity after World War II. And so I'm really pressing for us to re-examine those jobs because they were, as I find it, there's a lot of the roots of what we would call neoliberalism today in terms of, a lot of harassment on the job, a lot of instability in terms of frequent layoffs and being called back. Those are experienced by auto workers in the 50s and 60s. We think of these things as extremely stable jobs. Well, they, in fact, they weren't in terms of model changes or shift layovers. And also what I think that you see in especially Chrysler and Detroit in the 60s is that kind of speed up and that intensive retaking of shop floor control by management that predates neoliberalism. So I think we get kind of like a sneak preview of neoliberal work arrangements. Mm-hmm. And I argue that the violence that meets that in Detroit and to some extent Windsor is a kind of sneak preview of the workplace violence that we'll see under neoliberalism, which is increasingly, I argue, an individual violence.
Oh, interesting. So is that, we can get into this, but, certainly the collective workplace seems to be going away and fewer people in unions. And sort of that idea. But with respect to the auto industry specifically, I find it interesting that, as you mentioned, not as stable as people think, even though we're, bringing back those jobs and making everything great again with manufacturing. But when we say like make it great again and bring everything back, as you say, you're nostalgic for a point in time that never actually existed.
Yeah, I mean, as is always the case with nostalgia, right? There are certainly things to be recommended about these jobs. They had union representation for the most part. They paid much greater than people with a high school degree or not even would be able to expect to have in the workplace today. They, had unions that were to some extent interested in social justice and at least trying on some level at times to make things better for racialized workers, female workers, etc. Right. And making a positive impact in their local communities, which is a capacity that we have less of if we don't have unions. But I mean, these were Walter Reuther, the famous UAW leader, at some point says we never did anything about conditions when he's talking about the 60s and 70s right before his death. He's like, he calls them gold-plated sweatshops. Right. So, the wages and benefits are much better in the 60s and 70s. But Dodge, Maine, the plant that these workers are, is 1915. Horrible work conditions, horrible safety conditions, people dying all the time, Donald Trump wants to bring it back, but he would not work 15 minutes in one of these factories.
Right.
I think that's something that we ignore. People talk about factory work, and I think they understand the monotony of factory work. And I think what's underscored, though, is the brutality of these workplaces and the toll that they took on these workers. So I think that's important. And yeah, we can, if you would like, explore what I'm talking about in terms of the individualization, because I think that's one of the key historical contributions I'm trying to make with this.
Yeah, I absolutely. I do want to get back to that, but it also, as you were speaking there, it made me think of this idea that in the past, certainly with millennials, but there's been a softening of the culture that people aren't as tough as they used to be. That back in the day, you just roll up your sleeves, you go to work, you tough it out, and you were fine. So how much of what you're talking about is maybe part of this idea of people getting soft and needing to be coddled, and the idea that what you're identifying as violence in the workplace, some people would just say, that's the way it is, that's the way it was, and you had to be tough to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, people would say that, and there certainly was a lot of violence that was seen as part of the job, right?
Right.
And I think for men, in terms of hazing, bullying, physical abuse, in terms of women, sexual harassment was or has been considered part of the job, right? And I don't think that, so as we change over time, I think hopefully we get a better understanding of what things people should not have to deal with at work. But certainly in this workplace, yeah. And so that's another thing that I was trying to get at is like, what do we define as violence? Because there was stuff that was considered part of the job that we would consider violent today, whether that was exposure to conditions or how your coworkers might treat you and it be accepted. And then we have this vision of workplace violence, I think, as we spoke about on the start, as something spectacular. Right. Like we, as you said, like the Winnipeg General Strike, or when somebody comes to their workplace with a machine gun and kills 17 people.
Right.
And obviously those are examples of workplace violence, and they're tragic. And my book argues that those two are understandable on more of a structural level than we have previously been willing to admit. But what I'd also argue is those are the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot more workers experience violence, a lot more workers use violence, a lot more workers have violence as part of their labor process than we tend to want to admit, because we do want to think things are just part of the job, and we don't actually want to admit what the daily toll of working to produce value under capitalism actually means for a lot of people.
But then how do we confront the idea, the sort of free market idea, and certainly the NFL has had to deal with this, that they say people know what they're signing up for. So when you go to the factory, you go to the plant, you go to work, you agree to work for this company, you are agreeing to what those conditions are. And then to say afterwards this was violent, or to try and get money as compensation for what happened there, the defense usually is, you signed up for this, you knew what it was. If you didn't want to do this, you could have gone somewhere else. So how do we reconcile that, and not even just as a legal defense for things, but just as
right. It was very much, I felt I was in a courtroom there for a second.
No, but just as the idea of, as you say, if this is part of capitalism, a big part of capitalism in North America is the idea of the free market, and that as the employee, if something is not right, you don't like the conditions, you in theory have the option to go somewhere else, to take your work somewhere else that either has better pay, better conditions, whatever it is. So how do we reconcile these two things?
I mean, well, fortunately for me, Sean, I'm not a super big fan of capitalism, so I have a nice end around right there. I'm not particularly wedded or invested to the idea of individual choice in employment in a free market. But what I will say is that, number one, the argument that, people know what they're getting into, hypothetically, you presented it as part of the NFL. I mean, I find that if that is the NFL's actual position, super ironic, considering I think as the years go by and more comes out, more and more people actually do know what they're getting into with football. We're seeing less and less people play football.
Right. Yeah.
Like, I believe, didn't Justin Timberlake say last week at the Super Bowl that he, while he was about to perform at halftime, that he would not let his own son play?
Yes. In his beautiful press conference where he says this, he's getting all this money from them, and he says, I wouldn't let my kid play. It's one of the most unintentionally funny press conferences ever.
Oh, I should track down a clip of that. Yeah.
It's so funny.
I think that actually the more people do know what they're getting into, the less they do it. The more people do know that what they're getting into is cigarette smoking, the less they do it. So, I mean, which is a similar example that used to be Crawford, right?
Right.
So I don't think that we do actually believe that societally, even in a free market society.
Okay.
Otherwise people wouldn't approve of putting regulations on cigarettes, The other thing I would think of there is again, you'd want to pull back to the larger choice. I mean, sure, you can make an argument that people have a choice whether to play football or baseball, right? Sure.
Yeah.
But if we want to understand that workplace violence exists quite a bit, like across industries, right? And again, with the recent wave of revelations about sexual harassment and abuse in industries, there was a lot of revelations about higher status or profile industries like Hollywood or politics. But there's also, there was that big story about how it worked in auto plants in the United States and, among farm workers. We're starting to see again that workplace violence exists across the entire spectrum of labor.
Right.
So then we don't actually have a choice. Where is one to go to work if violence is prevalent across all sectors of employment, which I believe it is. I mean, we don't have a universal basic income, basically, outside of a few pilot projects, and the level of social services that we furnish for those who don't work is extremely poverty level. Mm-hmm. So, I don't think we do have a choice about working, and then thus about depending on our different levels of where we come from and what kind of resources we can draw on. We have varying exposures to violence based on that. So I think we need to look at the entire environment and change that. And so again, that's why my book was informed by, why did this happen? Really taking it outside of looking at the individual psychology of people. Because I think that gets us not very far down the road, and trying to understand what a concept I borrowed from public health that helped me was the concept of the risk environment.
Okay, so that being the risk that that people are willing to accept?
Not exactly. So the risk environment comes from Tim Rhodes and other researchers in public health who were trying to address HIV/AIDS related harms, or trying to drug related harms that would persist in higher levels of HIV/AIDS infection. Okay. So originally there had been kind of like an individual responsibility model of, well, people shouldn't share needles. Right. People shouldn't have unprotected sex. People shouldn't do these high risk behaviors that might lead to greater transmission of HIV/AIDS. Right. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that doesn't get very far. Just scientifically, that doesn't work to tell people, well, you should take responsibility and not share needles or use condoms. What actually matters, they find, is like, well, what's the environment that people are around? If you make the environment easier for people to make better choices, like, for example, if you provide needle exchanges, all of a sudden, like, the risk of people using dirty needles goes down because you've changed the environment, right? Yeah. And so in what I took a look at in terms of the labor situation in the 60s and 70s in these auto factories was that it created an environment where the likelihood that somebody would think that using violence was a legitimate response to their situation was very high. And so, what do we do to change that environment? And that's different with different kinds of violence. It's different with different kinds of workplaces. But I do think that we need to make kind of structural environmental level interventions into workplaces in meaningful ways to really address the roots of why violence happens.
Okay, so that's really interesting. The idea that the auto industry and the workplaces in the auto industry during this time that you're writing about actually fostered violence. Yes. And how does a workplace then foster violence? Like, how does that manifest itself in a place where when you listen to employers talk, right? And certainly the research I've done personally is earlier than this, and it's not in the manufacturing sector, right? Like broadcasting is very different in terms of what people are trying to get out of each other. As you're talking, I can think of cases where things could be considered violence within the broadcasting industry in the 1930s, but in the auto industry, there's a tangible product that has to come out at the end of it. So when you listen to employers talk, or certainly, and I've read about Henry Ford and all that, his whole goal, or stated goal, was to put people in a situation where they could make cars in the most efficient way possible. That's the goal. That's how you're going to make money. How does the environment in which production is key, create cars, build stuff, in what ways does that foster violence? Because to me, violence in any way, even if it's over working people or harassment, sexual harassment, whatever it is, that is counter to the efficiency of the space, reduces the amount of work that can be done. So why would the structure of the space that is established by the employer be one that allows, permits, or even promotes violence when, to my mind, it runs counter to the ultimate goal of the plant?
That's a good question. So looking at Chrysler, for example, in Detroit in the 1960s, theoretically, yes, what Ford laid out, obviously harmony would be great because harmony would lead to theoretically the greatest possible production, and anything that detracted from harmony would theoretically be, discouraged, right, as an independent production. But, like a lot of theoretical things, when you're actually running a factory that 20,000 people work at, I mean, there's a lot of things that happen, right?
Right.
And so bigger picture things get privileged over other things, and it's the combination of what you choose and what you discourage that creates the workplace. So specifically with this Chrysler workplace, it's the late 60s. Boom time, there's this Vietnam War boom for American automakers. Production's high, demand is high. Chrysler, though, is competing with not only the other big two, but they're competing with increasingly Japanese and German automakers who have a greater and greater share of the market as the 60s, and then, of course, 70s and 80s will go on, right? Mm-hmm. So they realize that during this period of economic productivity, they need to basically make as much money as they can.
Right.
And Chrysler, being a historically undercapitalized company, unlike Ford or GM, and has never invested that tons of money in automation, realizes the best way to do that is to hire as many people as possible. They hire less people, work them longer, work them harder,
right,
and produce as many cars as they can with the smallest workplaces they can. So again, we are still talking about efficiency.
Right.
We're still talking about maximizing productivity from the workforce that you have. But now we're starting to see how you can do that in ways that actually might encourage violence. So especially what they do is they hire predominantly African-American young workforce that has less seniority, less rights, less status in the workplace than the previous generation in Detroit of largely Polish-American workers at these plants. And they hire more supervisors to drive the workers harder in order to get more work out. So they decide to manage people through harassment, overtime, and they don't invest in things like safety. They don't, they run the line as fast and as hard as they can because, again, that's seen as most efficient and most productive. Right. And you have, mostly black workers being driven really hard by mostly white supervisors with a lot of verbal harassment involved and threats of firing in a city that, had been riven by racial tension and just had in 1967 a major uprising over the, treatment of African Americans generally by the powers that be in the city, right?
And basically what you're describing could be also have taken place on a cotton plantation in the 1840s.
I mean, sure. I mean, there's definitely a race management aspect here, and there's a everything is secondary to getting the job out. So I think I'm hopefully starting to paint a picture of how these changes actually work to foster a lot of harassment and a lot of violence. And what I did in my book at that Detroit plant was I went through the grievance files for 25 years at that Dodge Main plant, which is the main Chrysler plant in Detroit, from 1950 to 1975, and I was able to count basically every grievance I came across that related to violence. And of course, that's a partial look at violence. There's so many violent things that happen that were not reported or we don't know about, but this was allowed me to get a sample. As historians, is what we have. And I was able to trace how, even with less people in the plant in the late 60s and early 70s, the number of violent incidences in these grievance records went way up. And interestingly, the amount of violence directed at supervisory personnel and plant guards went way up. So, I mean, it's obvious that there was an environment created that had a much higher risk of violence because of the way that the factory was run.
And how much of that boils down simply to then trust between employer and employee? Because the case that you described, obviously what's happening is they're bringing in people with the intent of lowering wages, having more control over the workforce, and trying to, in this sort of subversive way, be as efficient as possible, be as profitable as possible. In that environment, though, there can't be a lot of trust between the employer and the employees. And it seems to me that if you can create a situation, I think co-ops, right? Every like 6 months, either CBC or someone does this glowing profile about a co-op that is working well and everyone gets along and it's like a family. And I'm always sort of dubious of those a little bit, but the idea is that the management and the employees, they're on the same team, whereas what you're describing is a situation where the employees and the management are set up to be opposed to each other.
And also the unionists, too.
Right.
So the UAW here, which is the locals, are predominantly run by older white workers that don't have a strong connection or sympathy to what's happening with the younger black workers at the plant, and so they see, and so a lot of the black workers feeling abandoned by both parties are forming their own black workers unions, like the Radical Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, who they increasingly are responding to violence in the factory and articulating a very violent rhetoric themselves. So yeah, it's an atmosphere of a lot of distrust and a lot of paranoia, and I certainly think that that's part of it. But I also, one of the things I liked that came up for me in the book that I didn't understand going in. When I started writing this book, I was really concerned with what caused violence. Why does violence happen at workplaces, right? Yeah. And I think I've supplied some useful historical evidence to why violence happened at these workplaces and what we can learn from that. But also, as I realized how saturated in violence these workplaces were, at all different levels, flowing in all these different directions, I became really, really interested with what impact would that have on the workplace? Like, this is something that would affect, how the cars got made, the culture of the workplace, how people interacted with each other on an everyday basis. And so I think you captured, that environment of distrust and paranoia was very strong at Detroit plants in the 60s and 70s. But plants, even like in the Windsor plants, which were much more cohesive, partly, I argue, because of a legacy of racial exclusion in those plants, and a legacy of gender exclusion in those plants into the 1970s. So in the Detroit plants, I describe what I describe as outsider violence, where people who feel alienated and feel like they're being shut out of the workplace and the power structure, and that they can't trust their union, they can't trust their boss. There's individualized violence happening there, right, as a reaction. Yep. And that doesn't describe all the violence that happened, but I think it captures the kind of overall tone. And in Windsor, though, where because of these exclusions and because, as I point out in the book, of their better economic position in those locals because of things like the Auto Pact, they have more cohesion, but there's still violence being directed, but it's more insider violence. I draw on E.P. Thompson's theory of moral economy to talk about, and this isn't always true. Sean Anteo, who's a master's student at Trent, has pointed out that some of the violence that workers were using was, in service to maybe a more revolutionary kind of leftist idea. But there also were, I think, accepted standards of how workers were to be treated in that workplace and how the job was to be done. And those were also enforced with violence. So if a supervisor was seen to have crossed a certain line, or if a worker was seen to have crossed a certain line into how things were done, there would also be violence there. So, in a workplace that may had a much higher degree of cohesion, there's still violence there to enforce norms and to be targeted at outsiders. Right. So when Pat Cunningham or other women came into the Windsor plant in the mid-70s, as she said, threatened the men, men felt threatened by the fact that a woman could do their job even, at that time. They had violence directed against them. So violence works in the situation we described in Detroit, where it's outsider violence and there's a lot of distrust, but also in the insider, when there's a lot of cohesion, there can be violence in an in-group way directed against outsiders or directed against people who violate the norms. Right,
because it's so interesting to me. And even not, it seems to me that in some of these revelations that have come out recently, when things become too insider, then there's violence within that inside group that doesn't get out because that inside group is so insular. So it's not necessarily just to the outside; it can also be against each other.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I was struck by when I was researching these plants in the 70s is I was like, why were people freaking out about this? I mean, we're talking about beatings with weapons and homicides going on at these workplaces. At some point, did everybody in North America agree that was just part of the job in terms of factory work? Yeah. And there's a part of it. It's like these are working class people who work in factories who, aren't considered as important by, the media or whatever. But I do think that there was a level in which the factory was considered a discrete world, and what happened in there to some extent. And it was understood among the people who worked there, but it was not seen as something that was dealt with in the greater society. Because there are moments throughout the 70s in the workplaces I study where the violence is so spectacular that it becomes, because of a criminal trial or media coverage, it becomes like a major story. And the New York Times does stories on how much violence there is in the Detroit factories. And so does Newsweek, for example. But at no point is that question asked about, why is there so much violence happening at work? And well, what kind of like how much violence should there be at work, and you know what I mean? Like
Right.
what are we expecting as a society in terms of what you should be expected to go through at your workplace? And
Right.
that doesn't happen until the mid to late 1980s, which I find really interesting. And as I kind of close out the book, I point out that when we do finally get an understanding that workplace violence is a problem, and it's connected specifically to the workplace, and there can and should be things that we do to try and deal with it. Then the problem, though, I argue, gets defined in ways that, like, a lot of violence gets left outside the box. And we've talked about many different kinds of violences, and it gets defined in a very individualized way. The larger violence issuing from environment or the labor process or things like that are not really considered part of the story. And we're still, I think, wrestling with that part of the equation now in our understanding of workplace violence. And judging back to how it was defined when it first became named as a discrete problem in the 80s.
Well, it seems to me that, as you alluded to there, a lot of it has to do with class, that, if I'm not in that situation, then whatever, it doesn't affect me at all.
You're driving your car, you don't think about how it got made. I'm
right.
on this Apple computer, most of the time I don't think about Foxconn, right? For sure.
Yeah. And then the other, I think, would, to a certain extent, be, if not purely racial, and obviously there's a racial element to it, but there's also a geographic element to this, that if I live in California, Texas, Florida, wherever, what do I care what happens in Detroit?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, in this specific case, right? So the way that these plants are centralized, if I'm outside Detroit, if I'm outside Michigan, if there's violence in the work plants or the auto plants in Detroit, well, okay. I mean, I'm living in Boise,
Sure, that's
leave me
true
alone,
too.
right?
Although I will argue that Detroit does get used over and over again, especially in this period, and Jefferson Cowie does a good job of explicating it too in his book Staying Alive. Like, Detroit gets used then as it gets used now as this iconic American working class city. So it's not just what's happening in Detroit; it gets used as a stand-in for working class America, right?
Right. Yeah, and I'm not trying to say that that's okay.
No, I know. I'm just saying that, so I think it does get a bit more media play than, say, a similar working class city would go to. But I think another reason is in terms of when I was in conversation with David Goldberg, who's a historian at Wayne State, about this, and he pointed out that a lot of it gets interpreted at the time as being connected to the quote unquote black problem in the United States.
Yep.
And he was like, white people have agency in the discourse and black people don't. So black people's violence is considered, and this, was not solely or exclusively black people's violence, but it was racialized as such, and thus it's seen as kind of group violence. And when it began to be committed by white people in the 1980s in this spectacular way at post offices, all of a sudden we had to understand it psychologically, because white people in America are afforded agency in what they do in a way that African Americans often aren't.
Right.
And it's just belonging to some kind of larger group consciousness. And I think that was pretty insightful.
Right. And that I think that doesn't just necessarily apply to black people either, right? You certainly the same thing happens if there's a violence in today's context by a Muslim individual, right? They represent then all Muslims, and that's not it seems to happen to minorities and not to white people. I would argue with the book that, just to quickly, I do think it does happen to white working class people. I do think that they are, I think it's unproblematically assumed that white working class men are violent or can be violent. And one of the contributions I was trying to make in this book is that's not an intrinsic part of being white and working class. It's part of the structures of white working class life in the 60s and 70s that encouraged violence. It's not, Yeah, and the way they vote too, right? They often get clumped together as white working class. This is why they vote. They vote together. So it doesn't acknowledge a diversity within that community. Yeah. So I think
the working class here is multiracial. It's not just a white working, that fantasy of the white working class that people bring up only to destroy it, but only to justify their own. It's really been an abused kind of political trope, especially with the rise of Trumpism. The working class that you see in my book is a multiracial working class, and it is one that is not intrinsically violent or It has a risk environment in which it exists.
I do want to get back to this idea of individualism too, and how this all plays out, because I think this certainly speaks to current issues and how all it works. But one of the things that's interesting is that in the early part of the 20th century, from the stuff I've read, the formation of unions, the idea of collective workplaces where we're in this together for whatever it is, better conditions, fewer hours, more wages, whatever it is that we're fighting for, this collective identity, and the process through which unions tried to forge that collective identity was a very violent process, and a lot of people associated unions with violence and associated left-wing movements that are associated with socialism, if not communism, as violent entities. So I'm curious as to how we get to the point from unions being seen as a source of violence to the individualization of workplaces, and as fewer people are members of unions, how that influences violence and perhaps an increase in violence.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's one of the major historiographic contributions I'm trying to make. I start the book with that example about the, people pressing for laws in which they can bring a gun to work. And I say at the start of the 20th century, if you were bringing a weapon to work, you were protecting yourself from the boss or from the RCMP or from the state police or whoever was working on behalf of your boss. And now people are arguing they need to do it to protect themselves from each other. And I think that that's really fundamental to what happened in terms of the experience of class in North America in the 20th and early 21st century. So historiographically, the kind of labor violence you talk about is very well represented in history. We've written a lot about it and studied it a lot. But I think there's a kind of assumption, which is maybe starting to be unsettled now, that after the Wagner Act and PC 1003 up here, that kind of compromise between labor and capital in the state, that violent class conflict kind of stops happening, right? That's the bad old days of class war, and that doesn't happen. The labor question, right?
Yeah.
And I said, we have that détente, and labor, mainstream labor basically hives off most of its more radical aspirations for reshaping society or transforming capitalism, and we get down to the serious late 20th century business of consumption, right? And what I argue happens is class conflict doesn't disappear. Class conflict mutates in all kinds of ways, and one of the ways it mutates is violence becomes individualized to reflect, I think, an increasingly atomized, individualized society. And, I think you can see that in the 60s and 70s. I think it's, in the book, what I'm trying to trace is a new kind of form of class violence and how that has historical roots. And I'm not trying to say that, all violence that happens in a workplace is a reflection of class conflict. It's not. For example, harassment and gender violence, to name, is obviously a reflection not just of what happens at the workplace, but also patriarchy and the historic gender dynamics of North American society, for example. But the overall tenor of workplace violence does change from being collective to individual over the course of the 20th century. And I think that that's something that we as historians, and even if you don't consider yourself a labor or working class historian, you should be really alive to, because I believe that, class and class experience and the experience of living under capitalism and going to work remains fundamental, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, but it changes. And what I'm trying to do in my work is trying to kind of understand the ways in which it changes and how the terrain of class conflict shifts. And one of the ways I believe is individual violence, and how that experience becomes more and more individualized. And so I think that's hopefully one of the fundamental contributions I'm making towards a conversation where we can understand a world in which we're all individuals, yet still profoundly class does continue to shape our lives, even if it's not as recognizable as it maybe was in 1910.
But that rise of that, and then you mentioned that it's the 1980s where people start to look at this as a real problem.
Yeah.
It seems like when it's a collective, right, and people come together and then there's violence, you can look at that and say, all right, well, what's going on? Large group of people. When it's individuals and it happens on an individual level, what seems to me often happens is that it gets brushed aside as, well, that person was just crazy. That person snapped, whatever it was. And therefore, we don't look at it as systematic. So it seems like those two things, in my head, just thinking about it, are in conflict with each other.
And so maybe that is a blind spot why it's taken us so hard to taken us so long to start to put this together. That workplace violence, as I write about in the book, is part of a larger structural way that the workplace is organized. But if you just consider it, think about the laughter and bitter, hollow laughter that happens online after yet another gun tragedy in the United States, where somebody says, "Oh, who could have seen this coming?" or "thoughts and prayers," or acknowledging the fact that what used to be dismissed as the individual act of a unhappy or disturbed person is now quite obviously deeply connected to the fact that the United States is awash in guns and mental illness, right? Yeah. And that you have to look at that as a wider structural thing. And I would point out just that these mass shootings in America began at the workplace. which is a point Mark Ames makes in his book Going Postal, I believe, and it's still a significant point. And so just like that, or individual workplace violence, or individual gun violence, or in the case of the project I'm working on now, addiction, what was once understood as something that just happened to individuals, or as we talked about with mental health earlier in the show, if you start to pull back and say, well, why is this happening over and over and over and over again? You realize the necessity to look at it structurally, but also to look at it historically and how it's changed over time is really important.
And somewhat sobering as well. Right?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
We all, even me, for the past 6 weeks or however long, I haven't been teaching. I mean, my workplace is my apartment now, right? For this time, as I'm working on other things, and even in that scenario, you're going to public spaces that are workplaces, whether it's the archives, libraries, whatever it is. We all exist in these spaces, so it's very important to recognize the processes, systems, whatever it is, the structures that can create violence.
Absolutely, and recognize that we're doing work, and we're doing work in all different kinds of ways in our life, sometimes paid and sometimes not, and trying to ensure that work is respected and safe and at least adequately compensated is something that we need to be aware of in a society where work is breaking down into such tiny pieces of gig work and unpaid work and care work and all these ways that maybe exist outside of a traditional 9-to-5 you're at an office or factory, but are very much labor, as you know.
Right. So again, this book, if anyone who's listening was on the fence about this book and thinking, well, it's just a labor history or it's just about the auto industry, there's clearly much wider ramifications for this. So we encourage everybody to go get the book, check it out. It is Blood, Sweat, and Fear, Violence at Work in the North American Auto Industry, 1960 to 1980. We have been very pleased to have Jeremy Milloy with us today. Jeremy, thanks so much for the time today.
Sean, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed our talk.
If anybody has any questions or comments for the podcast, it is historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is @Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.